But to put it in a nutshell, we basically discovered that although not everybody who is against the state of Israel or anti-Zionist is necessarily anti-Semitic, we discovered in some countries that group may be 13 times more likely to be anti-Semitic. So we can't say that everybody who's against Israel is anti-Zionist or anti-Semitic, but we can say that if people holding certain views, if somebody says, for example, that Israel's like apartheid or Israel's like Nazis or something, instead of saying, you're anti-Semitic, we can actually now say scientifically, you may not be anti-Semitic, but you should know people who say these horrible things are 13 times more likely to be anti-Semitic than the average members of the population.
Right.
So it's a way to sort of try and counteract some of the anti-Israel, the demonization of Israel that's been going on for, especially strong since the Intifada.
Very nice, very nice. As far as the blood, going back to the issue of the Ethiopian blood donations, I heard that the biggest issue that really, made them angry, or everybody angry, was that they said that they were willing to take the blood, but then they just threw it away.
Right. Yeah, so a lot of people were very, hurt and upset and felt humiliated, and there were charges of racism and all sorts of things. It was a very heated issue at the time. And through the work of Ed Kaplan and others, I think they helped the government to sort of diffuse the situation.
So today, do they use the blood donations of the Ethiopian?
I believe they do, yes.
Tell us about the Barry Cosman lecture.
So Barry Cosman's lecture, he was actually looking at sort of the emergence of new anti-Semitism. Barry Cosman was the former director of a Jewish research institute in London that deals with public policy, and he's now at Trinity College as a fellow there. And he was looking really at the new emergence of the new anti-Semitism in Europe, and how the relationship, he was focusing on the relationship between, I'd say, extreme Islam and the anti-Judaism and anti-Zionism embedded in their rhetoric, and how it related to sort of liberal anti-Semitism in Europe. So it was a fascinating discussion.
What about going into the beginning of November, you had David Hirsch.
Right, so David Hirsch, he gave a very good lecture, I thought. He's a professor at Goldsmiths College at the University of London. And if you remember last summer, the Association of University Teachers, which is sort of the official union of all university teachers, voted to boycott Israel.
Yes.
And they wanted to sever all ties with Israeli universities, but not only Israeli universities, but all Israeli academics. And the out was that people, Israelis, let's say, teaching at British universities, were given the right to denounce their citizenship. If they would renege on their citizenship, they would not be boycotted.
The Israeli citizenship?
Yeah. So it was a very extreme and very disturbing event, and it shocked a lot of people. So what David Hirsch did is he started a group called Engage, and it's actually, you can find them on the website. And he organized university professors from all over the United Kingdom to counteract this decision made by their union. And within about 2.5 months, he was able to, garner a lot of support, force another meeting of the National Assembly of the Union, and he overturned the decision that was made by a small group of virulent anti-Semitic and anti-Zionist activists.
Were they removed, or are they still at the helm of the organization?
I believe they were not removed, and they're still at the helm, but the policy was overturned. And I think it was a great embarrassment for the British academic system. So I think many people under the leadership of David Hirsch, I think, took action. And David subsequently, he gave a presentation on his experience, but also on the emergence of anti-Semitism in the UK. And so he looks at anti-Semitism, I think, within the left.
What was his main argument?
He was looking at the history of anti-Semitism within, I guess, a Marxist or liberal framework in UK intellectual discourse. And he is of the left, and so it was interesting. So it was a critique from within the left of anti-Semitism historically, from the time of Marx and then to the contemporary moment. Sort of the Marxist view of Zionism historically, with the emergence of the State of Israel, and post-67, how things have changed and why.
Did he characterize the boycott of the professors as the type of boycotts that were taking place in Eastern Europe between the world wars?
He actually made comparisons, yeah, between, I think, the treatment of Israel, the treatment of Jewish intellectuals during the interwar period in Eastern and Central Europe, and the treatment of Jewish intellectuals in Britain today. So it was a stark and disturbing comparison.
It is very disturbing. And what could possibly be the argument for the other side to posit such a position of boycotting individual Israeli professors based on their nationality?
Right.
I mean, what do they say?
It's outrageous, and it stems from, the rhetoric has been going on for so long. I actually studied and taught in England, and I was there for about 12 years, mostly in the 80s and 90s. And the anti-Israel rhetoric and the demonization of Israel goes so deep, and it's been going on for so long that Israel is like apartheid, Israel is like a Nazi state. All Israelis are fascist. All Israelis are occupying soldiers. There's really a dehumanization of Israelis, and it went to such an extent that it becomes self-fulfilling prophecies. I don't think the people who are passing those resolutions realize how deep their hatred goes. And it went to the point where they were telling British scholars that it's not only Israeli institutions, but actually Israeli citizens in England were somehow not considered to be worthy of working at a university. So it's very totalitarian and dogmatic. It's disturbing. And what's equally disturbing is that the resolution was passed in an assembly of educated people. And I think it took a few months through the work of David Hirsch and others really to educate people what was going on.
How did they sneak that through? And how many professors voted for it?
I don't remember the vote, but you were talking about hundreds of people voting, and it wasn't snuck through. I mean, there was a group of us that were concerned about the vote for months. I mean, they were lobbying and advertising, and it wasn't snuck. It was well orchestrated.
Scary stuff.
Campaign.
Wow.
Yeah.
How about the Irving Abella lecture?
Irving Abella gave a lecture on the contemporary, I guess, condition of anti-Semitism in Canada. And Irving Abella is a preeminent historian, basically of Jewish Canadian history. He's a professor at York University in Toronto. He's also the former head of the Canadian Jewish Congress, so he's active.
Canadian Jewish Congress.
Yeah, so he's active in the Canadian Jewish community and really an eminent scholar. And he spoke about sort of I'd say anti-Semitism among new Muslim immigrants in Canada, and how they're sort of connecting to this, I guess, the older, more traditional forms of anti-Semitism in Canadian society that were traditionally on the right, but also to some extent on the left. So he was sort of speaking about this now.
Wonderful. Now you're Canadian yourself, you're from Montreal. Just candidly, what was your experience with anti-Semitism in Canada?
Growing up as a kid? Okay, I did part of my doctoral thesis was looking at the history of anti-Semitism and racism in Canada. Growing up in Canada, I think I grew up at a time when I think everything was possible. But we also grew up in a society that was heavily segregated, I'd say a generation earlier. So, for example, my father's generation were not allowed to go to McGill University, which was sort of the Anglo-Saxon English school. They were permitted to go to the French Catholic school at Université de Montréal, which was French and predominantly Catholic. McGill accepted Jews, but with a small quota, basically. And there was a history of sort of institutional completeness, we call this in sociology, where Jewish doctors and Jewish patients were not permitted to go to Catholic hospitals and that sort of thing. Jewish doctors weren't allowed to touch Catholics in Quebec for many years. So I grew up in a society where Jewish people weren't allowed to ski in certain areas. We weren't allowed to live in many parts of Montreal. So my generation, I was born in the 60s, was really the first generation where Jewish people were permitted to live anywhere they wanted, essentially. But we grew up in a society that was changing. There was this quiet revolution where Quebec was a traditionally French Catholic society and religious. And in the 50s, 60s, it became very secular and rapidly secular. So I guess growing up in Quebec, I experienced instances, neighbors who didn't like Jewish people, and there were problems in high schools, like most people, I guess, kids experience. But in general, it was sort of a good time to grow up in Montreal. The city was vibrant and that sort of thing.
What you described, as far as a thin quota of Jews going to McGill and only being able to go to the French University, that was really not in your childhood. That was more in the
the quotas at McGill were eliminated in the late 60s.
Late 60s?
Late 60s.
Okay, so I want to contrast that because we're about the same age.
Right, okay.
And I grew up in Great Neck, Long Island, which was 90% Jewish. And this is like from Mars, what you're describing as far, we never encountered anything like that. It was total freedom in New York for the Jewish people in the 60s.